time for the Sunday Scrum here on CBC News Network, and as reaction to the political assassination continues to pour in, Canada is also voicing its shock and disapproval. The murder comes on the heels of months of heated rhetoric from Ottawa aimed at the Kremlin over the situation in Ukraine. The politicians had their say. Now we'll have ours. Freelance columnist Susan Riley joins us from Ottawa, and with her there is the CBC's Rosemary Barton. So good to see you both. Good morning. Prime Minister Stephen Harper released the following statement in the wake of the killing. This is what the Prime Minister had to say. "I was shocked and saddened to learn of the murder of leading Russian opposition figure and former Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov. Those responsible for this brazen crime must be held to account in a swift, transparent and independent investigation." Transparent and independent investigation, says Harper. We know that Putin plans to lead the investigation personally. So, Rosie, I know, you're chuckling there because a lot of people, as John was just saying, it is kind of Kafkaesque in many ways, because there are those that think that Putin himself or Putin's entourage or someone directly or indirectly associated with Putin is responsible for this.
Yeah, I think that those words chosen by the Prime Minister were chosen in a very pointed way as a direct message to Putin and to his government that just the notion that he could personally investigate the murder of one of his, the most perhaps outspoken critic and his opponent is pretty ridiculous. I understand why Putin might want it to appear that way, but for Western nations, particularly like Canada, who are so heavily invested in what is happening in Ukraine, that is not going to fly, clearly. The timing of this is, and I know you've been talking about it all morning, very important here, because Nemtsov was about to report back on what he believed Russia was doing, or Russian paid or encouraged rebels are doing in eastern Ukraine. He was trying to make that link to the Russian people. So for him to be killed just before that happens is obviously going to be a problem and a provocation for Western countries. Forget within Russia, but for Western countries who have been pushing this idea for a long time and who are very concerned, in spite of the ceasefire, that Putin and whoever he is backing are not listening to what they're saying. I think this is a really defining moment, not only for Russia, but for the Ukrainian-Russian crisis.
Susan, what do you think?
I think that Vladimir Putin's got a lot. That probably Stephen Harper is perhaps the last person on a very long list of people that Vladimir Putin's got to worry about. I mean, he's got a lot bigger worries.
Yes.
Everything that happens in post-Soviet Russia reminds me of a John le Carre novel. I mean, there's mysterious poisonings, there's, assassinations at the foot of the Kremlin. In this case, there's even I think a 30-year-old Ukrainian blonde model involved. It's almost cartoonish from a distance in some senses. Certainly, the fingers of suspicion will point at Putin and his entourage. But keep in mind an important point that Putin apparently has got is at 80% popularity rating still in Russia, and Stephen Harper's at what? The most recently, around 40 or something.
You could argue that Russia doesn't have the open democracy that Canada has. That
Good polling.
Right.
Equitable polling.
I suppose you could, but I don't think it's. I think it's. Well, it's obviously it's Byzantine. Of course it is. Right. It's Russia. It's complicated.
What about Rosie, the opposition? How are we hearing from the opposition on all of this?
I haven't heard much. Immediately what struck me, because this broke on Friday as I was hosting, and Chris Alexander was actually the first person out of the gate. And as you know, he's used to be, his career has been as a diplomat. And he called Nemtsov his friend and an ally of democracy. And he was clearly struck by the way that he was gunned down just outside the Kremlin. So I do think, and then we heard obviously from the Foreign Affairs Minister and from the Prime Minister, I do think that the government is paying close attention to how this unfolds, because Nemtsov was viewed as a promoter of democracy, as someone that the West could speak to. I mean, he had been in Canada fairly recently, and gave interviews promoting democracy and his willingness to take on Putin. So to lose an ally like that for Western nations, as unimportant as we may be in all of this, is significant. And I think everyone will agree with that, including opposition leaders in this country.
All right, let's turn to the fight against ISIS and the proposed anti-terror legislation here at home. It's a topic we keep talking about because it certainly Important to discuss. More Canadians are believed to have gone to join ISIS this week. Here's what Public Safety Minister Stephen Blaney had to say about it.
This is demonstrating the urgent need to move on with the work that is accomplished by our law enforcement and security intelligence. We can be reassured that they are doing their utmost.
All right. They didn't go this week that we know of. I meant to say that the news of them leaving in the past month or so came out this week. And so, Rosie, the government is basically saying that this terror bill would stop that. Would it? Those 6 from Montreal that left, would the new terror legislation have stopped them from going?
I can't answer that. I mean, and I'm someone who has been briefed about the bill, who's read the bill multiple times and looked at it and analyzed it and read everything I can about it. But the government is certainly making that suggestion. What they are not able to do, though, is to display or defend exactly how that would have prevented these people from leaving. They were asked that question multiple times through this week. They say that it would help. It's not clear to me how it would help. If people aren't on intelligence agencies' radars or authorities' radars, how do you prevent them? How do you seize their passport? How do you stop them from leaving? In fact, one of the things that Stephen Blaney said a handful of times that it's important for the people around these people who are being radicalized to speak up and say something. Well, then you're putting the onus on families and friends to react and to do something. Well, that has nothing to do with C-51. There are things in C-51 that would allow you to detain someone longer if you had suspicions around them, to disrupt anything they might be doing to promote terrorism, and possibly to shut down things that they are doing, right? But I mean, if you look at some of these Twitter accounts related to the people in Quebec, particularly the young woman that is out there, it's pretty anodyne stuff. You wouldn't know that this is where her head was at least I wouldn't from looking at it. So I don't think the government at this stage is doing a particularly good job at explaining how C-51 would prevent people from becoming foreign fighters. And I'm not sure that's what it's supposed to do anyway. I thought it was supposed to limit what happens here, but anyway.
The other instance was I believe there was a young woman in Edmonton who was radicalized and who left. She was on a CSIS watch list. They forgot to tell the Edmonton police, or they didn't. I'm sure they didn't forget. They deliberately didn't tell the Edmonton police, probably because perhaps they didn't trust the Edmonton police to keep it, keep it in the office. Whether this anti-terrorism legislation will fix that, it sounds like a big relationship and trust issue to me rather than a legislative issue. I'm entirely unsure. Also, there was another case, I believe one of the young fugitives from Quebec, his father was concerned and took his passport away, and then the young lad went and applied and got another passport. Again, he wasn't on anybody's watch list either. We've talked this anti-terrorism bill to death, and it's got some strong points and useful points and a lot of stuff that sounds pretty sinister but may never be used. I think it's way more important to work on cultivating relationships between parents who are concerned about their kids or friends or siblings or imams in mosques and the authorities. I mean, how do you build those bridges? How do you phone and say, I'm really worried about my child, without the fear of your child being immediately slammed into solitary confinement somewhere? Or, I mean, to me, that would have more practical effect.
Rosie, let me ask you, because you brought up the idea that the government seems to be suggesting that, families need to do more, that the onus is on the families. The opposition is saying, no, there needs to be some kind of de-radicalization in this bill. I'm not sure how Tom Mulcair is suggesting that would work. I don't know how you legislate that. I'm not sure. And any sense from the government as to why that's not in there?
Well, I mean, there isn't anything that is necessarily to de-radicalize someone, which I think everyone agrees is an extremely complex and subjective idea, right? Ideas attract people for different reasons, so we can't just do a one-size-fits-all thing. There are things within the bill, and particularly around what is going on online, that would shut down conversations around this kind of thing, which would, I guess, then limit how much impact online, where a lot of this stuff seems to be happening, seducing of young people with these ideas is happening. So you could shut that down. Is there a broad, long-term strategy based on the so-called root causes or sociological issues going on here to try and prevent this? Not really. And I'm not sure if the government is planning on introducing something. I mean, they have little things that they're doing in various ways, but there wasn't a big splashy announcement about this. And that is problematic. There are major policies and programs in place in other countries. Some of them have some success, and there is a consensus within this country that probably more needs to be done as well. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and that's the other thing that the opposition has been harping on, but is true, is that if you want the police to do and accomplish all these things, the authorities, let's say, they will probably at some point need more money. They'll need more resources. Yeah. I mean, and that doesn't seem to be forthcoming.
All right, let's switch gears now to the ongoing saga of Keystone XL pipeline. It seems like it's been a really busy week. President Barack Obama, as expected, he vetoed the bill that would have allowed the start of the construction of the pipeline. And now a former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Alan Gottlieb, came out and said he can't remember a time that relations between the U.S. and Canada have been this cool. That was certainly interesting to hear that. Rosie, are you hearing anything about that in terms of the relationship between Canada and the U.S. as a result of this veto?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your perception and where things are at. I mean, I don't think it's a secret that President Obama and Prime Minister Harper are not the best of friends and are going to play golf together. That's not the nature of their relationship, and that might matter and it might not matter. I don't think that that's what's happening with Keystone. I think that there is a very strong lobby within the U.S. for this not to go ahead. There are concerns that the promise that Canada has made around economic benefits, including jobs, will not actually be very fruitful. And particularly from the president, that this is more about Canada getting oil to a refinery rather than Canada doing something great for the United States. This wasn't surprising. We expected this to happen, and it's sort of stuck now. And maybe it is stuck until there is a new administration, either a Republican administration or there is a new prime minister here, because I don't see really where this is going.
Well, there was an interesting suggestion this week online from Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire former mayor of New York City, and Republican conservative in his leanings, and very business oriented, but a strong environmentalist. He sort of became an environmentalist, during the time he was mayor, and he's addressed this issue and the Keystone specifically, and he's charted a potential way out for both. For Obama primarily, which is that Canada and the United States sit down and agree to a joint approach to climate change, to mitigating emissions. He calls it win-win. He said if you can, reduce, contain emissions from the oil sands and yet continue production, you satisfy the president's concerns, and you satisfy Harper's concerns, because that's the United States' natural market for that oil, and it needs a pipeline to get there. Maybe it's idealistic, but I thought it was very interesting. Let me put it this way. I bet you that'll get Obama's ear much more quickly than, our ambassador in Washington will.